This video took far too long to make. As I've discussed in my previous two videos, the Halo games are not flawless, and need a good dose of analytical examination. Thankfully, in this video, I won't need to spend nearly as much time discussing Bungie's behind-the-scenes activity. Unlike its predecessor, Halo 3's external drama didn't take place within Bungie's headquarters. It came from the fans. Campaign enthusiasts were desperate to find out what happens after Halo 2's abomination of an ending. Multiplayer combatants were expecting an improvement over what was widely considered to be one of the greatest multiplayer games ever made. Xbox 360 owners wanted Microsoft's golden child to shine with HD glory. The hype train for Halo 3 was unparalleled at the time, gaining even more public attention than in 2004. But the question isn't, did Halo 3 live up to these expectations? The question is, does Halo 3 live up to the expectations of today? Success and disaster are not always mutually exclusive. Halo 2 ran away with every accolade in the book, including the title of the best-selling game on Microsoft's console. But the game's development was met with so many pitfalls that Bungie's first order of business was ensuring they would never have to repeat them. Knowing how much work it took to complete Halo 2, and understanding that they were making a bigger game on a console with a lot more horsepower, meant that Bungie would need to greatly expand their staff. In fact, Bungie expanded its team enough to require a new office in Kirkland, Washington, to accommodate them. With their large number of employees and a new office, the next step was making sure that the game wouldn't be compromised and rushed during development. Halo 2 spent its early stages being run by a committee that didn't have the experience or planning to sustain, forcing Jason Jones to come in as project lead during the year of crunch time. Meanwhile, Halo 3 spent its first 12 months in pre-production, and the game wasn't formally announced until 2 years after Halo 2's launch. Whether it was one of these changes or all of the above, Halo 3's development did proceed at a consistent pace. It wasn't easy, but that's true for almost any video game. Co-op was almost removed, but in the end, the game released to the public the way it was intended. Thanks to this relatively smooth development, Bungie managed to innovate before releasing the game with their public beta. To my knowledge, a first for console shooters. Just as with Halo 2's regenerating health system, this practice has been abused recently, with betas that are more accurately demos since they're using a build of the game that's weeks away from going gold. But it was properly done with Halo 3. It allowed players to get a taste of what was in store months prior to launch, and it gave Bungie enough time to implement changes based on feedback and in-game data. This was a lot more effective than the Halo 2 E3 demo, which wasn't playable on the show floor and wasn't representative of the final product. While the development was mostly drama-free, there was some contention with how Microsoft was handling the Halo brand. While Bungie developed Halo 3, Microsoft was trying to expand Halo into many other genres. Handhelds, MMOs, RTSs, David Cages, and films. Only one of these panned out, Halo Wars in 2009 by the now defunct Ensemble Studios. 1 out of 5 is not a good track record for content producers, and while I doubt this is the only reason Bungie would go on to leave Microsoft, I'm sure they weren't very impressed. Regardless, Microsoft's ineptitude would prove to not make much of a dent, as Halo 3 was released on September 25, 2007, to overwhelming critical and commercial success. Halo 2 greatly expanded the number of species that made up the grand totalitarian faction known as the Covenant, but this did result in a change that was potentially devastating. The Elites, arguably Halo's most recognizable enemy, would never be fought against in the trilogy's grand finale. As the game's first VDOC shows, the brutes did not receive as much attention as desired during Halo 2's development. And with the elites being allies to humanity, the brutes needed to be done properly this time. So, are they just as fun, dynamic, and interesting of an opponent as the near iconic elite soldiers? Not quite, but they are admirably close. And considering what the brutes were, it should be praised. Gameplay changes were expected, and Bungie's proficiency with combat guaranteed that these enemies would behave with the other Covenant. The damage they absorb, the way they navigate an environment, and affect the behavior of fellow soldiers is accomplished with experience and talent. What really sells the brutes as a worthy adversary is the art design. While they retain some of the Wookiee look, the brutes have a lot more unique features and qualities that distinguish them from other species in the Covenant. Halo is a franchise where each game has gotten progressively shinier. Forerunner structures, along with the Covenant's boner for spotless purple, it's refreshing to see an alien race that is barbaric and gritty, while using parts of this clean, cutting-edge technology. The brutes have their own equipment, weapons, and vehicles, while using parts and armor that's more traditionally Covenant and Forerunner. Speaking of which, I'm mostly talking about the art design because I believe it's a greater success than the raw application of the brute weapons and vehicles. The Spiker is an inaccurate pea shooter, and the Mauler is a gimmicky bitch smacker that only appears a handful of times. The Brute Shot is a retooled weapon from the previous game, but I have to admit that the highlight is without a doubt the Gravity Hammer. This incarnation of the weapon is still my favorite. It has just the right amount of force, radius effect, sound design, and splash damage. Admittedly, it's just another version of weapons we've seen before, and its unique applicability isn't showcased very often, but that doesn't change the satisfaction you get upon using it. Being a third game in the franchise, it's no surprise that the developers don't have as many concepts for weapons that occupy different sectors of the Halo sandbox. Let's use grenades as an example. The Spike Grenade is just a variation of the Plasma Grenade. It has the same basic function, and a ricochet characteristic that rarely results in a unique kill. Incendiaries, on the other hand, are different, introducing the concept of a grenade that can not only be used for killing enemies within its radius, but also suppressing them with a lasting fire effect that will damage them if they come in contact with it. But just like the Mauler, these grenades are used so infrequently, it's surprising that they're even in the game to begin with. Vehicles are the same story. The Chopper has a unique ability that adds new challenges and opportunities to the gameplay. Meanwhile, the Prowler is more or less a faster brute version of the Warthog and Spectre. The Chopper's splatter ability also isn't as satisfying as it should be. When destroying another vehicle, it feels less like you're crushing multiple tons of metal, and more like you're running over a construction barrier. In summary, the brutes are overall a great adversary. I can't help but prefer the elites over them due to their more expressive character model, but this is personal preference, especially since Halo 3 is the only game where brutes are the primary enemies. Something else that makes the brutes work in this game is what Bungie did with their storytelling. The plot in each Halo game I've covered so far has been mediocre at best, and Halo 3 is no exception. I've always argued that the story presentation is more impressive than the story itself. But in previous games, that story presentation is never really translated into gameplay, with the only exception being the Flood reveal, where the Master Chief's first encounter with this new enemy is simultaneously experienced by the player. Bungie has an attention for detail, but in previous games, these additions didn't really contribute to the story. They existed to immerse the player in the world in action. Meanwhile, Halo 3 puts in a lot more effort to change this, through unique animations and activities to in-game NPC dialogue. The Arbiter is a good example here. The initial backlash to the character is mostly forgotten, and I believe Halo 3's use of the character has a lot to do with this. He's not just another Keith David badass, but during gameplay, he is often heard wishing that the jackals and grunts he's killing disbelieved the Covenant prophets. Every firefight concludes not just with visceral satisfaction, but also emotional weight thanks to the Arbiter's inner conflict. He doesn't want to kill his former brothers, but they will not listen to him or his elites because he's viewed as a heretic. The best part is that this emotional depth isn't shoved down your throat in cutscenes. It's brought in-game without anything to interrupt the action. This also translates to the objectives that the player needs to accomplish. The second mission of the game features many of Halo's gameplay tropes: corridor section, three-wave defense section, backtracking, shooting gallery, etc. On paper, this level should be my least favorite in the game. Yet it isn't, because these sections are given proper context. When you're moving across the large military complex to protect an air hangar from the three waves of enemies, the game explains that the Marines are spread too thin and that the Master Chief is the only one who is powerful enough to hold off that many enemies single-handedly. It's the most logically sound decision to have the Master Chief protect this section of the base while the Marines escape with as few casualties as possible. It's not Shakespeare, but the game's reason isn't technical. You're not holding off three waves of enemies because the game designer didn't want to use their brain that particular day. It's because you're protecting humanity from total annihilation. It's an example of what dramatic purpose can lend to gameplay. It makes me wonder if the courtyard sections and outskirts should be redesigned or simply given some narrative context that they lack. Either way, Bungie's storytelling improved greatly in Halo 3 because of these additions, and while I didn't notice them as a 13-year-old kid back in 2007, I certainly appreciate it now after completing this trilogy. But not every new addition to the story is a success.
Could you sacrifice me to complete your mission? Could you watch me die?
This is the first moment in the game where we receive an unclear transmission from Cortana, Master Chief's guardian angel who was left behind in Halo 2, and this moment is powerful. It paints a bleak picture from a tag team partnership that normally lends so much lighthearted banter to the series. I've mentioned my distaste for the AI's usage of melodrama, but I can forgive it here, as the line has a greater purpose than just to set up a gameplay scenario like in Combat Evolved. The problem is that greater purpose is mishandled. Cortana's transmissions have no effect on gameplay, and they have no apparent effect on the Master Chief since he's a silent protagonist outside of cutscenes. When Chief gets his first transmission, the Marines comment on his current state.
Sir, you okay?
Your vitals just pinged KIA.
But the game can't effectively communicate the Chief's state of mind, because not only are these transmissions repetitive in their vague messages and their animations, but also in where they're placed. Where upon entering a sector of the map that's meant to act as a bridge between one combat area and the next, Cortana shows up. It makes her personal status become an eye roll. Hours later into the game, her transmissions become a source of boredom and tedium. The Chief's lack of an emotional response would be okay if that gap was filled by the player, but in my case, it wasn't. I wouldn't be surprised if Bungie experimented with the idea of having these transmissions appear at random intervals during gameplay, and I can see the problems that would arise. Halo's combat model is the pillar that separates it from every other shooter on the market, and if Cortana keeps showing up to mess with it, that could drive some people away. But I feel that there must have been a better way to communicate Cortana's plight than what appeared in the final build. These moments are technically in-game, the same way that Gears of War's radio conversations are technically in-game. There's still a break from what's going on in the game. If you receive a message from Cortana, there's no consequence to anything, no matter what you do. If the gameplay paused every time Cortana sent something, it'd be the same result as what we already have. Let's use the game's most hated level for the final point. There are multiple reasons why the game's penultimate level is despised. One of them for me is the usage of Cortana's transmissions in the Gravemind speech. This is a level where Bungie could have done something as tiny as allowing the player to move at a normal speed instead of slowing down when Cortana sent a transmission, communicating through gameplay that the Chief is urgently trying to get his partner back. Just something. Anything to alter the gameplay to benefit the story in a level that is clearly focused on story and lets down in the gameplay department with its use of the worst enemies. But they don't. Instead, the game hits the pause button 5 times more often than previously to try and communicate its message, one that it's spent communicating in 20-minute intervals of every stage.
You need to constantly remind players of what they're missing, that this thing is something worth going after. But if it was just a straight, now go find her, here's a map, people wouldn't care.
I agree with Joe's reasoning and the writer's intentions. I just don't agree with their result. And speaking of which,
by having the reality of death a part of the story, it did actually introduce this tone of heroism.
true, if the game didn't falsely manipulate the story to result in the death of characters. In fact, there's something I need to double check here.
We had been working on this story nonstop, making compromise after compromise because there were a lot of things that different people didn't agree on.
Dude, the story should be about Earth getting destroyed, or let's show the Chief's face. That'd be a really good idea.
Radio for VTOL. Heavy lift gear.
We write the first draft of the script, but it's not great. Man, do I really want to give all this credit to Marty?
I didn't see any shape to this story. Nothing happy, nothing sad, nothing intense.
But premature firing will destroy the Ark.
It's like, I think it needs more punch.
Unacceptable! Unacceptable!
What it really needs is some death.
Replaying this game made me question how literal this might be. The campaign's story feels as if not much happened in it emotionally in the first draft, and in the editing process, those same events were only slightly adjusted to result in the death of a character, even though the original script didn't set up a dramatic stage for these deaths to make sense. Nearly every person I've talked to agrees that each of these character deaths feels more akin to a season finale on the CW rather than an epic trilogy story of galactic war. I'm not saying this to argue that my point is correct. I think anyone that uses the other people agree with me so therefore I'm right argument is a fool. My question is that if myself and so many people share this distaste, what about the people at Bungie? Wouldn't they think it's kind of ridiculous that Miranda Keyes, a character without much buildup or many irrational decisions made, would suddenly crash into a tower of Covenant powerhouses with nothing more than a shotgun and pistol? Especially when there are other Marines out there who could help her, and when the Chief and Arbiter are on the same floor of the same tower? And Johnson's is even more illogical. It's easy to complain about a beloved character being killed by a light bulb, but let's not take the easy road. Why is Johnson even the one doing this? Is it because Chief's better off defending the empty hallway? These hallways are pretty big. And don't take this the wrong way, I'm okay with a bit of melodrama. I mean, look at this ending cutscene. Is there really any tension? Did you really think the first time playing this that Chief was just going to be flung out at the very end? I didn't. But these corny close calls don't exist to add tension. They exist so we can get this shot. And you know what? That's fine. Some minor annoyances for a decent shot is okay. But when the game simultaneously tries to elicit sadness from players through the use of death, you can't half-ass it. Gameplay-wise, Halo 3 is a hybrid, taking the ingredients of what worked with Halo 1 and 2 and slowly blending them together. Of the two games, I believe that Halo 3 leans more towards Combat Evolved than its predecessor. It ditches the faster pace but keeps the added elements to Halo's core from the sequel while retaining the larger, more open level design of Halo 1, along with improving the vehicle handling and combat model. Halo 3 is less focused on adding to Halo's core gameplay and spends more energy on carefully tuning each enemy, weapon, and environment, something that both games weren't able to do because of their hectic development. I've talked about some of their missteps with the Spiker firearm and grenades, but aside from a couple minor gripes, Halo 3's combat and variety of locations and arenas is excellent. The pacing has improved substantially. Whereas Combat Evolved declined at the halfway point, and Halo 2 had a linear first act and a 60% failure rate with the Arbiter levels, Halo 3 doesn't suffer from nearly as high of a descent. Floodgate's mediocre, and Cortana is the worst offender, and the game's finale is a retread of the original, but the large majority of this game's campaign is tight as a drum. None of the levels are mind-blowing or revolutionary, but it's seamless to play through. Unlike Combat Evolved in Halo 2, I went through this game over a small number of long play sessions. The story cutscenes are just as good as they've always been. There's enough breathing room from the action. The in-game subtext through character dialogue and atmosphere is effective. I can go on. The score by Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore is once again phenomenal. The big improvement here compared to previous games is how the music is edited. This time, Marty composed lots of ambient pieces that build up in layers and scale depending on the player's actions. Though I don't believe this game's soundtrack surpasses its predecessor overall, and I mainly attribute this to Marty's usage of re-recording. Halo 2's score was mostly new, not just in songs but also in sound. Halo 2 featured much more visceral anthems with guitars and solos, along with more haunting and melancholic soundscapes. Meanwhile, Halo 3's soundtrack is just like the game, a blending of Halos 1 and 2, with some of its own blood thrown into the mix. Thing is, most of the new material, while atmospheric and beneficial to the game, isn't very memorable, and the melodies that are largely consist of re-recordings of ones we've already heard. Granted, these re-recordings are better than the originals. I love its rendition of the Halo theme, the subtle renditions of the new Mombasa pieces, and my favorite re-recording, the new version of Dust and Echoes, titled after the game's final line of dialogue. While some of the new material isn't as memorable, there are most definitely some standouts, with Farthest Outpost being the one for me, with its haunting introduction, and effective build-up. Aside from music, the audio design all around is great. Each category of sound has to have at least one complaint from me, and in this case it's that the battle rifle sounds weaker than in Halo 2. But other than that, when the combat is in full force, the music, gunshots, explosions, ambient effects, and voice actors all combine brilliantly. Speaking of which, nearly all the voice talent is as solid as ever. Once again, some of the melodrama is still annoying, but none of the actors are at fault. They all do great work with what they have. Except one, because by far the weakest link is Terrence Stamp as the Prophet of Truth. Now, I love Terrence Stamp and his unique delivery, but it just does not fit this character at all. Talk about Hader versus Sutherland as much as the internet does, but I think this comparison has a lot more merit. Michael Wincott's performance is hands down superior to that of Stamp's. He's menacing and charismatic. His delivery makes you want to listen to every syllable. Terrence, on the other hand, sounds less like a threatening but also captivating antagonist, and more like Mein Kampf narrated by Alex Jones.
The moment of salvation is at hand.
In a moment, I will light the rings, and all who believe shall be saved.
His introduction is literally him shutting off the electronics and popping up on the monitor like adware. Except instead of trying to sell you Viagra, he's raving and looning about becoming a god. And like a broken record, repeats this over and over, until he finally gets stamped. Overall, my opinion has changed. I used to dislike Halo 3's campaign, but now I realize it's because my thoughts of it had been tainted with frustrating co-op runs and boring replays in pursuit of armor pieces. Upon replaying this flawed but great shooter, I think it's the best campaign of the original trilogy. But it's not my favorite Halo, and it's time to explain why. Let me preface this by saying that I love Halo 3's multiplayer. I bought the Collector's Edition on launch day, I spent hours on it daily, I bought Bungie Pro, I made dozens of Forge maps, I browsed Forge Hub for new maps and game types, I made awful montages, I deranked accounts for easy clips, and among all of this douchebaggery, I've totaled around the same amount of games as Halo 2. Point is, I've done a lot of stuff in this game, and I admit that just like the campaign, I've had to reassess my feelings on the multiplayer component. I'm a much different person than when I was a teenager, and having a full-on addiction to this game led to a lot of frustration that is not a fault of the game itself, but the idiot playing it. So what does the multiplayer do correctly? Being a hybrid of Halo 2's weapons and map design, with Halo 1's slower pace and more methodical gameplay, Halo 3 is a more clinical game. I'm not sure if the kill times are slower in this game than in Halo 2, but it feels like the effort required to get a kill is a little higher in this installment, which I actually like. Killing somebody quickly at the start of a match now doesn't just require you to pick up a second SMG like in Halo 2's defaults. The assault rifle puts everyone on the same field at the very start, and unlike Halo 1 and Halo 2's more competitive modes, which weapons you pick up at the start has a lot more weight, because Halo 3 is the first game to not have a full jack-of-all-trades weapon. The battle rifle is still the most consistent in the game, but it's not as flawless as it was in Halo 2, thanks to its lack of glitches. Now, both the assault rifle and the SMG can defeat it in close-range scenarios, something that didn't occur very often once the BXR and double shots were discovered. In fact, a lot of Halo 3's changes mostly have to do with how polished it is compared to Halo 2. Animations are smooth and can't be easily cancelled, flags don't bounce around the map, and melee attacks don't miss nearly as often. Halo 3 is a game that's played by its rules, not by that of the community. That part of the game was now fully separated into the custom game lobbies and Forge maps. For all intents and purposes, I think Halo 3 is an excellent multiplayer game, and one that I enjoy revisiting, with its polish, finely tuned weapon balance, and addictive gameplay. I just think Halo 2's better, and I'll try to argue why. First off, maps. Halo 3's maps pale in comparison to its predecessor. To be fair, Halo 2's levels were a tough act to follow, and Halo 3 does have a few great ones. Guardians, Narrows, The Pit, High Ground, and Epitaph are probably my top 5 picks from the game. But even when observing these maps, none of them don't achieve anything that its predecessor didn't. Guardian, while great, really is Lockout 2.0. Narrows might just be the simplest map in a Halo game in terms of layout. The Pit is perfectly symmetrical for a more traditional competitive layout. High Ground's experimental concepts were abandoned to repeat one that was already seen in Zanzibar, and Bungie released an alternate version of Epitaph called Epilogue, with different weapon layouts to account for imbalances with the shotgun and bubble shield. The rest of the maps either share an unoriginal or bland layout and design, or are directly taken from previous maps. Blackout is Lockout, but worse. Avalanche is Sidewinder, but worse. Cold Storage is Chillout, but worse. Last Resort is Zanzibar, but worse. Heretic is Midship, but worse. Valhalla is Blood Gulch, but okay, this one is actually a little better, but still unremarkable. Assembly is an aborted fetus of Warlock and Midship. Construct far too often becomes more about camping lifts. Citadel may just be the laziest map to ever be released in a Halo game, reminiscent of Gearbox's maps on Halo PC, which just copy-pasted rooms from the campaign. Foundry is either an empty canvas we had to pay money for, or a horrible layout that you could wipe out. It's too bad that Onslaught is not an official map, because then it'd be on my top 5 list. Ghost Town belongs in a Call of Duty game with too many bumps and cracks in the level's geometry that interfere with the player's ability to effectively aim and maneuver. Isolation was probably taken over by artists who thought they were designers, when actually they just made a gimmick map without an interesting gimmick. Longshore. Wait, which map is that one? Oh, right, this one, which no one remembers. It's not even bad or great, something much worse. It's bland. The same can also be said for Orbital. I think someone came up with this map's layout when they happened to have pens side by side on a desk. Rat's Nest is a good comedy map for laughing at players crashing into one another, but the gameplay is not very interesting. If you want to actually capture flags effectively, you would quickly throw the flag down the middle where there's actual cover and friendlies to help you out. But this discourages you to use vehicles, which is what makes the map more fun. Sand Trap's only saving grace are the elephants. Other than that, it's a map that's gotten its best usage out of machinimas, not big team battle matches with a flat layout and a sniper rifle that is far too easy to camp spawns from. Sandbox's default layout is somehow even worse than Foundry's. I've made better maps than this with my feet. Snowbound is, well,
stupid fucking snowbound.
Standoff is decent for CTF matches, but for Team Deathmatch, it has the same problem as Foundation in Halo 2, where the default weapon doesn't have enough range to make battles interesting, and the battle rifle has too much range, degenerating into boring stop-and-pop cover shooting like Gears of War. And, wow, that's every single map in the game. And I dismissed all of them with a sentence or paragraph. I certainly didn't have this issue with Halo 2. For the record, I repeat that when I say these maps are worse than their counterparts, I don't mean they're bad, and for all my ranting, maps like Longshore, Standoff, and Ghost Town aren't awful. They're just average, and don't stand out like Headlong, Sanctuary, or Turf did. And the main reason I attribute that these remakes are worse is that the layout of these maps don't take Halo 3's weapon balance, speed, and equipment into account. Most of these remakes are smaller than their counterparts, and that's because the designers had to make up for the fact that this game is slower than Halo 2, but the environments now feel too strict without enough room to maneuver. But in the case of remakes such as Last Resort, it's the exact opposite. The map has been greatly expanded, only it now makes it more boring to navigate since you've got to cover more ground at a slower pace. And since I mentioned equipment, let's finally talk about it. After Halo 2's release, every game in the series since has tried to implement a fourth element in combat to a system that's always had three: weapons, grenades, and melee attacks. Halo 3 is the first attempt at this, and it's by far the weakest. Campaign-wise, most of the equipment isn't even that useful. Frequently, I'd forget that I'd even have a piece of equipment during combat. For every bubble shield or regen station, there's 3 more useless items, like the flare, radar jammer, or deployable shield with a shorter endurance than a geeky version. The AI doesn't know how to use these either, often placing equipment while shooting their comrades, and don't seem to have much consideration for what equipment they have. They'll throw bubble shields down in the exact same way they throw flares, as if they're rolling a piece of dice and hoping it transforms into something benefiting them upon landing. In multiplayer, no one touches the bad equipment, like the radar jammer on Narrows, and decent equipment has a small number of uses. Bubble shields often just lead to delayed encounters. Regen stations typically lead to stupid melee battles, and the power drainer is just a free kill for the user. If someone has a power drainer or regen, there's nothing you can do to counter it, other than hope the person using it messes up, and that's not very interesting. There's no long-term consequence to equipment, and the effect it has in the short term is so immediate that it's just an annoyance. That's why I don't hate equipment and can enjoy Halo 3's multiplayer despite its inclusion. But when I play competitive modes that don't feature them, I don't miss them in the slightest. Speaking of competitive modes, this is when MLG variants became much more significant. Major League Gaming didn't use the game's default settings and then make slight tweaks to the starting weapons and ones located on the map. This time they adjusted the player's movement speed, damage output, weapon and power-up locations, and added custom maps of their own. This is the variant of Halo 3 that was made to satisfy Halo 2 lovers. It has the faster pace, the more visceral gameplay, and the Titan-focused balancing, the strategies, and the tension. The BR battles are actually more interesting this time around, since the need to lead shots can have some pretty epic reversals. But the lack of asymmetric maps and MLG variants is pretty apparent. To be fair, this was by and large the same case with Halo 2, but it's just too bad that so many competitive maps use an almost identical design. What Halo 3 revolutionized wasn't its gameplay, map design, modes, or interaction. What Halo 3 improved the most was the community tools. As scummy as it is to sell people maps clearly tailored to Forge creations, people involved in custom games jumped on these maps because this one stage could deliver countless hours of entertainment, whether it's competitive gaming or party modes. Bungie's ideas they had to abandon with Halo 2's multiplayer truly shined in Halo 3 with the innovative theater mode, dated and clunky but heavily used Forge mode, and the brilliant file sharing system that gave a sense of community unrivaled by any other console shooter at the time. But this is the crux of Halo 3. I've seen it often referred to as the best game in the series, the peak that no other game in the franchise afterward was able to match. But I've never shared those feelings. Even at the time of release, I can agree its campaign is the best in the trilogy, but I can't say the same for the multiplayer. What truly peaked in Halo 3 was its community. I don't mean the people, God no, it was as toxic back then as Call of Duty is now, but the tools for sharing content, photos, clips, and game types made for an experience that offered something new at every turn. Halo didn't peak with its third installment, but it was the last time it would be leading the genre of console shooters.